DND number 2, Suffer the Children in Jesus' Name. Chapter 2. Caroline didn't see Toby again that evening. Between the time she'd helped with food preparations for the night's celebration and gone up to fetch the children for dinner, he left for the party. She didn't have time to think about him anyway, because as more friends of the Smiths arrived, so did more children. By the time everyone was there, Carol had 8 children to watch and, more importantly, to keep out of the way so the adults could party. No way was she upset about not being included as an adult, for she had no desire to be around a bunch of grown-ups who were drinking and being goofy. The children's ages ranged from Lynn, the youngest, at 3, to Ben, the oldest, at 8. A large family room in the rear of the house was the children's designated play area. Carol stood in the center of the family room and looked from face to face. She grinned. "We're going to have a blast," she declared, amidst cheers from the kids. The family room was quickly established as base. From there, a delightfully long hallway that ran the entire length of the house became the major racetrack. It led from the family room to the far end of the house, where it took a sharp turn to the left and opened into a game room. They began in that hallway by playing regular games like Red Light, Green Light, and Mother May I, and moved on to playing ones Carol had invented. Even though they had their own goodies, one of the favorite games involved a mission to sneak into the front room where the parents partied and swipe snacks without being seen. Afterward, they sat around munching on their spoils of war as Carol told them funny stories. Carol knew she was supposed to be working, but actually she was having an awesome time. She thought she might have trouble with Ben at first when he showed reluctance to join in, but now he was laughing and playing just like everyone else. Having overheard what he'd said the day before, she felt triumphant. Being the youngest, Paul and Lynn were partied out by 9:30, and Carol left Ben in charge for the few minutes it took to take them upstairs and tuck them into bed. They were so tired that they fell sound asleep almost immediately. Now the real fun could begin, Carol thought with a widening smile. The remaining 6 children were just old enough to hear scary stories and just young enough to make it fun. Back downstairs, they turned off all the lights in the family room and sat in a circle on the floor. Armed with a flashlight, Carol altered her speaking voice into her version of a scary witch. She had to keep from laughing at the wide-eyed stares of the children. She told story after story. Thanks to her love of reading, she knew lots of them. She would finish a particularly scary story, and the children would run, screaming down the length of the hall as she chased them, cackling like a witch. They screamed as they turned at the end of the hallway and had to run past the witch to make it back to base again, where they would settle for another round. They were hot and sweaty and full of chips and dip and sodas and having a grand time. Toby, meanwhile, was not having quite so much fun at his party. In the basement of a friend's home, lights were low and music loud. He could barely carry on a conversation with Amy, the girl every boy dreamed of being with. From what he could gather, she was pouting over what some girlfriend had done to another girlfriend, and didn't he think it was just a shame? Whatever. He glanced around the room, searching for signs of life. Some of the kids were making an effort to dance to the music. A few, including his friend Jeff, were playing cards. Others were getting pretty hot in the corner. Toby glanced up toward the stairs to see if any chaperones were nearby. There were none in sight, and it was a good thing, too, judging from what he could see from where he sat. No wonder the host parents had insisted that all boys had to be gone the minute the clock struck 12. The girls, on the other hand, would stay for a giant slumber party. Toby smiled. Now that would be fun to come back and crash. He turned his attention back to Amy, and she smiled at him. "Oh, poor Toby. You're not having a very good time, are you?" She moved to sit on his lap. Now that's better, he thought. She put her hand in his, and he took it and turned it over this way and that, but his deliberations had him frowning. Carol was invading his thoughts. She meant nothing to him, so why was he thinking about her now? Probably because he had taken Carol's hand earlier today in much the same way. He tried to wipe her from his mind, but he couldn't help himself. He had to compare. Amy's hand was so different from Carol's. Amy had those fake kind of nails and 3 rings on one hand alone. And Carol's nails were short, plain, and she wore no jewelry. He was being judgmental, he told himself. There certainly was nothing wrong with Amy being a little more sophisticated than Carol, if that's what it was. After all, Amy was older and came from money. Of course, she would know a little more about life. No, Toby corrected himself. It was actually just the opposite, wasn't it? Amy was the one who knew nothing about life, not real life. Amy shifted over his legs, bringing him back to the present. Did she know what she was doing? Maybe having her sit on his lap wasn't such a good idea. She leaned close to his ear, pressing herself against him. A penny for your thoughts. Well, now, he couldn't very well tell her what her current position was making him think. Well, she said with a pout. Quickly, he lifted her off his lap before he embarrassed himself, turned abruptly, and pulled her up to dance a slow dance, and still, he couldn't even get her to do that. She stopped every few seconds to talk to girlfriends, chattering away as if he didn't exist. Amy, Toby thought, was absolutely and completely beautiful, and absolutely and completely interested in one thing: herself. Why was he just realizing that? He knew why. It was that little girl. Why could he not get her out of his mind? Carol had done something to him, bewitched him somehow. He was miserable the rest of the night and only too happy when Jeff, also bored, suggested that they leave early. Meanwhile, Carol's games had progressed to hide-and-go-seek in the dark. Most of the hiding places were in the game room, behind chairs, in closets, under the pool table, and behind the door. The eerie silence would be broken intermittently by shrieks of laughter when someone was found and tried to rush back through the darkness down the long hallway to base. Shortly before midnight, Toby came in through the kitchen door. He peeked in at the adult party and smiled at his father dancing with his mom, their party hats pointing upward. He had just been wondering what Carol and the kids were up to when he heard laughter and screams coming from the rear of the house. Grinning, he quickly decided he'd join in on the fun. He swung open the hall door. There was a terrible-sounding thump, silence, and then a soft moan. He reached for the light switch immediately. Carol lay flat on her back, a huge goose egg growing on her forehead. The children crept from their hiding places one by one, eyes wide, peering down at their fallen caretaker. Toby dropped down by her side. "Oh, Lord, Carol, what happened?" "I was running back to base, and—" She put her hand to her head and moaned. "And I opened the door right into you," he finished for her. "I'll get Mom," Molly cried, rushing off. "No, wait," Carol called. Trying to rise up, she appealed to Toby. "Please don't tell. They'll think I was being irresponsible. I'm okay, really." Molly stopped and waited for her brother's okay. However, he wasn't convinced. "I don't know. It looks pretty bad." "Please," she whispered. "It's almost midnight. It'll ruin their party." Her eyes held such fear he couldn't resist her. He turned to his little brother. "Ben, sneak in and get some of that crushed ice, and be quick." Toby turned back to Carol, his fingers moving over her head. "Okay, we won't tell, but you gotta lie back down and let me put some ice on your head." She smiled with relief as she obeyed. Ben rushed back in with a large handful of crushed ice, and he slapped it on her head. "Ben, get a towel or napkin or something," Toby snapped. "And do you have to be so rough? Here, let me do it." Toby took over. He looked into her eyes as he placed a towel full of ice on the bump. "Are you sure you're okay?" "I'm fine," she confirmed, sitting up to show it. "Children," Mrs. Smith called, "it's almost New Year's. Come on in and you can watch the ball come down on the TV." The children scrambled off to see. Toby reached his hand out to Carol and pulled her up, and she stood shakily. "You okay?" he asked. "Not dizzy or anything?" She shook her head. The two of them inched into the front room and leaned unseen against the back wall. Carol slid down the wall to sit, and Toby joined her. They watched as the kids were given pots and pans and spoons and horns to make noise. "Pots and pans?" Carol questioned. Toby smiled. "Yeah, it's a tradition." "A tradition?" "Yeah, we do it every year. We have lots of traditions." "Like what?" He shrugged. "Well, black-eyed peas and greens for dinner tomorrow. That's a New Year's tradition." She made a face. "Why peas and greens?" "It's supposed to bring you good fortune or money or something like that." He turned to face her. "How's your head?" "It's okay." "Here, let me see." He touched her chin and turned her face toward him. "Man, it looks terrible. It's huge." "I feel really bad about this. I am sorry, Caro. You know I didn't mean to hurt you." "I'm okay, Toby. Stop making such a big deal about it." He studied her face. She was so sweet, so kind, so different. And the other girl would be making a very big deal about it. His mind flashed to the drama that would be taking place right now if it had been Amy whose head he'd bashed. This time he didn't try to stop the thoughts. He let himself compare Amy to Caro. Amy was indeed beautiful, but when he studied Caro, he saw that her big brown eyes were perfectly shaped and warm and sweet, and Caro was definitely skinnier and barely had any breasts at all. Why did that suddenly seem unimportant? A few days ago it seemed breasts were hugely important. And just look at Caro's mouth, a perfect bow, pink, no weird colored lipstick. She wore a slight smile, not a forced pout like Amy. If he turned toward her right now, he could kiss her before she could pull away, and he'd bet she'd never been kissed before. The thought possessed him. Just one touch of his mouth to hers. That's all he needed. Then maybe he could put these ridiculous thoughts to rest. It'd probably scare her, though, he thought, but decided it was worth a try. I know another New Year's tradition, he said softly. Really? What? At the stroke of midnight, you're supposed to kiss someone. It'll bring you good luck. She eyed him, her face turning pink. That's a dumb tradition. He laughed. Well, I don't think it's dumb. And you saying that just shows how young you are. She pursed her lips, and he licked his. She was so cute, and she sure didn't like him saying she was young. They could just see the TV from where they sat against the wall. The ball in Times Square started its downward journey, and Caroline watched as the children began to dance around in circles and bang spoons on the pots and pans, and the room seemed to swirl around her. There was a buzzing in her head as the ball reached its destination. She watched as the adults each grabbed their husbands or wives and kissed them, some very passionately. The sound in her head was getting louder, and she wasn't sure if it was from the lump on her forehead or from what she was about to do, but before she could change her mind, she turned to Toby and pressed her mouth to his cheek. "Happy New Year," she whispered. He smiled. "Back at you, Caro." New scene. The next morning, New Year's Day, Caroline was the first one awake. She went about the business of cleaning up from the party and fixing breakfast for the little ones. Mrs. Smith was the next to arrive in the kitchen, moaning and heading straight for the coffee maker. Glancing up at Caro, she gasped, "What happened to your head, child?" Caroline looked anxiously up at her. I ran into the door when we were playing last night. It's okay. It's just a little sore." "Lord have mercy, it looks as if someone hit you in the head with a baseball bat. Come over here and sit down and let me take a look at that." Caroline did so, albeit reluctantly. "What's the matter?" Mrs. Stillwater asked as she entered the kitchen, but one look at Caro told her the problem. "What in the world? Caro, are you okay, honey?" "I'm fine. I just ran into a door last night. It doesn't hurt." Mrs. Smith made her look into a flashlight and count fingers, and she pressed on the lump several times, making Caroline wince. "I don't want you doing another lick of work today. You are to rest until I'm sure you're okay." "But no buts, young lady." "What's up?" Toby asked as he entered the fray. His mother turned on him. "Toby, did you know about Carol getting hurt?" His expression fell and his eyes lowered. Yes, ma'am, but I thought she was okay. Is something wrong?" He glanced worriedly over at Carol where she sat on the stool, and Carol rolled her eyes, making him smile. She was just fine. "And just what are you grinning at? I hardly think this is funny, young man. Just look at her poor head." He sobered immediately. "No, ma'am, it's not funny a bit." He went to Carol's side and held out his hand. "I'll take her out for a nice, quiet walk. Maybe the fresh, cold air will make her feel better." "You do that," his mother agreed, "and don't forget to wear your coats." New scene. It was a heavenly day. Cold, yes, but the sun was shining, and the farm was beautiful, and Carol's new coat was doing its job. Toby showed Carol the horses, promising a ride later if his mom declared her fit enough. They wandered down the creek, where they skipped stones and talked about school. He led her through a path in the woods coming out on the other side of the farm. A barn came into view, and he took her inside and showed her around. They climbed into the loft and stretched out on bales of hay, staring up into the rafters. The tip of Toby's finger touched Carol's little finger, and suddenly they were holding hands. It was the first time Carol had ever held hands with a boy. A slight tremor ran up her arm toward her heart. It's a nice feeling, she thought. She liked it. She liked it just fine. It seemed as natural as walking or talking. She had a friend, and she felt she could trust him with anything. It made her feel sort of funny inside. Good funny. What do you want to be when you grow up? She asked. I'm not sure what I want to do. How about you? She was silent a moment, and finally she turned on her side to face him. I want to be a dancer, she whispered. He considered that for a while. Really? A dancer, huh? She smiled. Uh-huh. Well, that would be cool, I guess. My daddy gave me a music box, and when you open it up, this tiny ballerina spins around. I can just sit and watch her for hours, making up stories in my head. He's gone now, but he used to say I could be anything I want to be, but it won't come to me. I have to go after it. He said it never hurt to try, and that's just what I'm going to do. Well, that sounds like pretty good advice. Maybe I should listen to that too. Why? What is it you want to try? He shrugged. Singing. He grimaced. It sounded pretty dumb when he said it out loud. Wow, can you sing? Well, my mom says I can. He laughed. I guess all moms say that. But my chorus teacher at school says I'm really good and that I should do something with it. I don't know. It's just a thought. And then there's baseball. Baseball? Yeah, Jeff and me, Who's Jeff? Oh, he's a friend of mine. We're going to be on the varsity baseball team. She blinked. Mm-hmm. It's a big deal, he said, realizing she didn't understand. I mean, like, we're the only two freshmen. Everyone else is older. Anyway, so what I was going to say is, well, I'd like to go pro. Oh, he shook his head. It probably seems silly to you, but playing pro baseball is a big deal to guys. What does your dad say about it? He talks a lot about being stable. What does he mean by that? I think he's saying he wants me to get a real job. He looked over at Caroline. So you said your dad is gone now. Where is he? Is he dead? She sat up. I don't know. He waited patiently for her to continue. He left us about 5 years ago. We don't know where he is. Maybe he is dead. Toby sat up next to her. Does it make you sad? Not me so much. Not anymore, but it makes my mama real sad. Wow, then it's not your dad that... He stopped himself. He'd been thinking out loud. Carol's head lowered, and she knew what he'd nearly said. Carol's mom was the one who beats her, not her dad. It was difficult for him to imagine. Moms are supposed to be sweet and kind. And they take care of you when you're sick and cheer you up when you're sad. And he tried to pick up the thread of the conversation. So, does your mom think he'll ever come back? Caroline shook her head. Mama says she wouldn't take him back if he came crawling on his hands and knees. Well, it sounds like she's more mad than sad. Sometimes she is, especially when she's drinking. Carol quickly looked up into Toby's face. I didn't mean to say that. Don't tell. He nodded solemnly. Don't worry. You can trust me. I told you I wouldn't tell any of your secrets. He took her hand again. Does she drink a lot? She only shrugged in answer. He squeezed her hand. It's okay if you don't want to talk about it right now. I guess we'd better get back. Breakfast will be ready, and I have chores that need doing. New scene. Later that afternoon, after all chores were done, Toby hooked the hay wagon up to the tractor and took the children for a ride, and Carol sat between Paul and Lynn, her arms tight around them so they wouldn't fall over or slide sideways. The children laughed and shrieked with glee as Toby turned in a sharp circle. While the children played, Mrs. Smith and Mrs. Stillwater prepared a delicious supper of black-eyed peas, greens, homemade macaroni and cheese, honey-glazed ham, buttery cornbread, and the biggest chocolate layer cake Carol had ever seen. Everything was scrumptious. After supper, Carol played with the little ones while dishes were being done, since she was still being babied over the lump on her forehead, which had become quite colorful. And when the adults joined her in the living room, Carol was surprised to see Toby carrying a guitar. Mrs. Smith sat down at the piano, and Toby sat on the edge of the piano bench. Over the next few hours, Carol was given a glimpse of what real family life could be. Everyone sang and laughed and told stories on each other. They argued and fussed, but only in a teasing sort of way. No one got mad, no tempers flared, no one yelled at Ben when he acted silly and accidentally knocked over a picture frame. And Molly sat snug in her father's lap while little Lynn had crawled up into her mother's arms and fallen fast asleep. Carol's heart yearned. She was stunned when the Stillwaters asked Toby to sing Amazing Grace. She'd never been to church, in fact, wasn't quite sure what to think about religion, but his rendition brought tears to her eyes. His teacher was right. He had a beautiful voice, strong, clear, like someone on television. He winked at her while he was singing, warming her heart and making her blush. Caroline glanced at the clock. It would be bedtime soon, and tomorrow she would go home. The feeling of hopelessness hit her hard. Oh, how she wished she could stay here forever. Oh, how she dreaded going back to the apartment she shared with her mother. How nice would it be to have a mother like Mrs. Stillwater or Mrs. Smith, and to live in a home like this, and most of all, to have a friend like Toby nearby every day. She frowned, feeling ashamed of herself. Those weren't very kind thoughts. Her mother needed her, depended on her. Carol pushed all her yearnings down into her heart and told them to be quiet. New scene. However much she didn't want it to, the next morning did arrive. Apparently, though, she wasn't through having fun just yet, for at the break of dawn Toby knocked on her door and poked his head in. She sat up sleepily. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," he answered with a smile. "Get dressed. I'm taking you out riding." "On a horse?" "No, on a pig." "Yes, a horse. Now get going before anyone else wakes up and tells me it's not a good idea." The wind was brisk as they walked down to the stables, but Carol felt toasty warm. Was it thanks to her new coat, or was it the young man walking beside her that made her feel that way? Toby talked to her as he saddled the animal, telling her about Molly, the mare they were about to ride. "Y'all named your sister after a horse?" He laughed. "No, they were both they were both born at the same time, and Ben's favorite name at the time was Molly." The look of utter bewilderment on her face made him chuckle. "You see, my father named me after his uncle, who died when my dad was a boy. But my mom never really liked the name." "She doesn't like Toby?" "Tobias. My name is Tobias." She made a face. "I like Toby better." He smiled. "Me too. Anyway, Mom said a child could name a baby better than that. So to prove it, when Ben was born, they let me name him. And it became a tradition. And when Molly was born, they let Ben name her. And he was only 3, and he had a book about a bunny named Molly. So at the time, it was his favorite name. The horse and Molly were born around the same time, and Ben insisted it be the horse's name too. And no one saw any reason to argue with him, so Molly joined our family." Caroline shook her head. "Your family is weird." "Weird, but nice." "Yeah, they are," he agreed. "But what about your name? I mean, Caro? What kind of name is that? Is it like Caro syrup?" he teased as he bent to tighten the cinch. She giggled. "No, it's like Caroline." He said it over a few times. "Caroline, huh? Like the princess?" "Yes. No. Yes, the I is long, but definitely not like a princess." "I like Caroline. I think that's what I'll call you. Everyone else can call you Caro, but I'll call you Caroline. Maybe even Princess Caroline. Well, Caroline, ready?" He bent down and cupped his hands. "Just step here with your left foot and swing your other leg over the saddle. Now don't be afraid. I'll get up right behind you." It took a few tries before she was able to make it, but she finally did. To Carol, it seemed like she was sitting 40 feet off the ground, and she was indeed afraid. And when she felt Toby move up behind her and wrap an arm around her waist, she relaxed. He seemed to know what he was doing. He felt very big behind her, his arms strong, and Caroline suddenly realized that for the first time and as long as she could remember, she felt safe. What a wonderful feeling! She closed her eyes for the sheer joy of it. Toby guided the horse down the path they had taken the day before, and they rode slowly past the barn and finally to open pasture. She smiled, experiencing the pleasure of the cold air as it hit her face, and the movement of the large animal beneath her, and the warmth of Toby's breath in her ear. Once in the open field, he leaned forward. "You want to take the reins?" She looked back at him, both excitement and apprehension in her eyes. Go ahead, you can do it. He placed the reins in her hands and showed her how to guide the horse. And Toby spoke calmly to Molly while Caroline tried to take over, but she was too afraid and quickly relinquished command. Toby laughed and took control again, deciding to give her a little thrill. His arm tightened around her. Hold on, she gasped as he kicked Molly into a canter. Caroline shrieked and laughed at the same time. This was better than any amusement park ride. Nevertheless, she was relieved when he slowed. It took several minutes for her heart to settle. They came to a stream, and Toby debated with himself whether to take her across. Deciding against it, he dismounted and helped her down. They walked to a nearby tree and sat with their backs against the tree trunk. He laid his hand out, and she slipped hers into it. Toby sighed. It figures. As soon as you find a good friend, they have to go away. Last night, I was wishing I could stay here forever, but doing that only makes it harder to leave. He looked into her eyes, and the thought hit him again. She sure didn't seem like she was only 12 years old. Do you miss your mom? She was silent for a long time. I do miss my mom. I miss her from the way she used to be a long time ago. Since my dad left us, she's different. Different? How? He waited through another long silence and finally spoke up to help her. You mean the drinking? She looked up, bravely refusing to let the tears pool in her eyes. She didn't used to drink. She used to be nice. At least I think she did. It's hard to remember. Now, though, all she seems to do is drink, and when she drinks, she gets real mean. I'm sorry, Caroline. I wish there was something I could do. Can't you talk to a teacher or someone like a school counselor? You could talk to my parents, or how about the Stillwaters? No! No! She jerked her hand away from him. Secrets, remember? Never tell anyone. I thought I could trust you. Hold it. Okay, you can. I forgot for a second, that's all. I just hate that I can't do something to help you, but I promise I won't say a word. I swear, he added solemnly. He put his arm around her shoulders and squeezed and sat quietly, giving her time to calm herself. Caroline drew a deep breath. Having you to talk to does help me. Don't you see? I don't need anyone else. He did see. What he saw was he'd taken on a huge responsibility. It was several minutes before he spoke again. I was just wondering, does your mom go to work? Yeah, she's like a secretary. She gets up and goes to work every morning and brings a bottle home with her every night, and she drinks until she passes out and gets up the next morning and does it all over again. Man, it must be hard. She shrugged. I get by. It's weird, though. Sometimes I love her, and sometimes I hate her. I know I shouldn't hate my own mother, but sometimes I wish I could just leave and never come back and not care what happens to her. He hurt for her. How must that feel to be so torn, to have no one to depend on, to have nowhere to go? He took the small gift he had for her out of his pocket. Here, I want you to have this. It's not much, but maybe when you need to tell someone a secret, you can tell him. Caroline rubbed her finger over the smooth wood of a small carved dog. I carved it a few years ago for a school project. It's the dog I told you about. She smiled. I love it. What's his name? Muttface. You named that poor doggy Muttface? He shrugged. He didn't know what it meant. What he did know was that he could trust me to take care of him and feed him and love him. I sure did love that dog. Thank you, Toby. I know this means a lot to you, and I promise to take very good care of it. He smiled. There was no use in comparing Caroline with Amy any longer. There simply was no comparison. I'm going to miss you, Princess Caroline. She leaned her head on his shoulder. I'm going to miss you too, Toby. What am I going to do without my friend to talk to? Well, we could call each other every week, he offered. Do you have a phone? She looked up at him, smiling sadly. A cell phone? No, just a regular phone, but I couldn't use it to call you. Mama would never let me. Well, then I'll call you. How about every Sunday, in the evening? Okay? And then we can tell each other more secrets, and you can tell me about your problems, and I'll tell you about mine. I don't think you have any problems. Everyone has problems, Caroline. Like right now, I'm going to be in big trouble for taking you out without permission, and everyone's probably worried about where we are and what we're doing, and they're going to tease me and say I'm sweet on you." She looked down immediately, embarrassed by his words. However, he tilted her chin up, and they'd be right. He held his hand out. "Come on." Without another word, he helped her back up onto Molly, and they rode silently back to the house. Toby kept his arms snugly around her the entire way. As they approached the house, they saw the Stillwaters already outside loading the van. Toby leaned close to her and whispered in her ear, "Be strong, Caroline." He kissed her cheek, dismounted, and lowered her to the ground. "Well now," Mr. Stillwater began, "we were wondering where the two of you had gotten off to." He was smiling a knowing smile at Toby, who lowered his head as he tied Molly off. Toby headed inside. I'll go help get stuff," he stammered. Paul and Lynn came out on the porch to see the big horsey, and the moment Toby reappeared with an armful of luggage, they demanded their turn. He quickly granted their pleas, and Caroline ducked inside to thank Mrs. Smith for everything and to run upstairs and straighten the room she'd used. On her way back down the stairs, Carol was handed an egg and cheese sandwich by Mrs. Stillwater, who patted her head with a smile. "Here you missed breakfast. Did you have fun with Toby?" Caroline knew her face was pink, and she nodded politely. "He's very nice." Everyone pitched in to help, and in what Carol thought to be much too short a time, they were ready to be on their way. And as everyone hugged and kissed, Carol stole a glance at Toby. He seemed troubled. Carol gave a little wave, unable to force a smile when she felt so sad. He smiled and winked, making her heart flutter, and only a few seconds later she and the Stillwaters were loaded in the van and pulling away from the huge glass house, heading home to Atlanta. Caroline peered out the van window as long as she could, watching Toby as he stood on the porch, leaning against a column, arms folded across his chest. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, forcing herself to turn her attention to the children. Everything would be okay, she thought, comforting herself. She could hardly wait for the next Sunday evening when she would hear his voice again. New scene. "Caroline, you better come when I call you," Virginia Jones yelled again. Caroline sighed. She had been trying to do her homework and hoped that if she pretended not to hear, her mother would give up, go to her room, and go to sleep. She rose slowly, sticking her paper inside the book to keep her place, but she was too late. Her door slammed open. Caroline whirled around to see her mom coming at her full speed with a coat hanger in her hand. "I was coming, Mama," she cried, moving quickly to dodge the first blow. The next one caught her, though, right across the back. She fell to her knees. It stung awfully bad. She raised her arm to block, but the wire hanger lashed across her forearm. She rolled away and struggled to stand. Standing turned out to be a mistake, and Carol's legs bore bright red streaks by the time her mother finally tired out. Virginia tossed the hanger aside and, stumbling around the room, knocking things over, swiping everything off Carol's dresser, she turned on Caro. "You've been mighty uppity since you've been home from your little trip." She grabbed Caroline by the hair. "You think just 'cause you get your hair all done and get a few new clothes that you don't have to come when I call you?" "No, ma'am," Caroline cried. "No, ma'am," her mother shouted, yanking on the lock of hair she held. "Well, that's not how it seems to me." "I'm sorry, Mama. I was coming. Really, I was." The tears streamed down her face as she reached up and tried to pull her hair free of her mother's grip. But she froze as her mother's expression suddenly changed to intense rage. "What are those?" her mother screamed. Terror gripped Caroline's heart. She had been careful to keep her hair down over her ears. She should have taken the earrings off and let the holes close up, but she thought maybe she could have this one little thing just for herself. Virginia grabbed her daughter by the ears. "Take them off." "Take them off now," she shrieked. "Okay, Mama, okay. Let me go, and I will." Her mother shoved her as she released her, sending Caroline flying across the bed. Quickly, she righted herself and with trembling hands removed the earrings. She held her hand out to her mother, who snatched the jewelry from her. For the next 15 minutes, Caroline listened to the rantings of a madwoman as she paced back and forth across the room, speaking of the evil that men do. Some of the language she used was extremely graphic, and Caroline's face reddened as her mother spoke of what her father was probably doing to some woman at this very minute, and that woman was probably wearing all manner of jewelry. Her mother crossed the room to where Caroline sat on the bed and grabbed her by the hair and yanked. That's all men want. They don't want wives. They don't want children. They just want to have as many women as possible. Her eyes narrowed. I better not catch you with a boy, Missy. If I do, you'll be very sorry, for you and for him. Now clean up this room and go to bed. Yes, ma'am, she whispered through her tears. Caroline waited for her mother to vacate the room before she rose to clean the mess. Wiping her cheeks, she began picking up the clutter, but stopped midway when she spotted her little mutt face. She scooped him up and sank to her knees. Oh, how she craved the feeling of safety she had experienced up in Tennessee, the feeling she'd had when her big, strong friend had hugged her close and made her feel like a real person. Oh, Toby, she whispered, I wish I could talk to you tonight. I would tell you 100 secrets. She cried herself to sleep, the little carving of mutt face held tight in her fist. New scene. Caroline wasn't sure why what happened the next day happened. She only knew it could never happen again. She'd been playing with Paul and Lynn when she realized it was almost time for Mr. Stillwater to be home. That meant it was time to clean up the toys, wash hands and faces, and wait for Daddy. For the first time ever, Paul was refusing to cooperate. Carol told him he better be good or she wouldn't play horsey with him tomorrow, and the warning didn't seem to faze him. He began to cry, and when she tried to put the toys away herself, he started screaming. Stop it, Paul, Carol ordered. She was tired and irritable herself since her mother's outburst the night before. No, he screamed. I don't want to clean up. I want to play. Stop putting my toys away. She tried to ignore him. She and Lynn continued putting blocks in the wagon and puzzle pieces in their places, but he ran at Lynn and pushed her over, and Lynn wailed. Carol whirled on him. Stop it, Paul. You hurt your sister. But he didn't stop. He cried and screamed and threw a fit like she'd never seen, and the next thing she knew, her hand met his face. Paul drew in a startled breath, and Lynn howled louder, and Carol stepped back, horrified. Paul put his hands up to his cheeks as if to protect himself from any further blows. That sight broke Caroline's heart, and she scooped him up in her arms, hugging him. Oh, baby, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The words echoed in her brain. Trembling, she placed Paul gently on his feet and backed away from him. Oh, no. I sound just like my mother. Panic took over. She was turning into her mother. She began pacing the room, talking to herself, berating herself as she choked down the sobs that were welling in her chest. Confused by their babysitter's odd behavior, Paul stopped screaming, and Lynn was down to small mewling sounds, and Carol finally got a grip and sat the children in front of the TV, then turned in a daze to finish straightening the room. And once she was done, she waited with dread in her heart for Mr. Stillwater's arrival. When he came in, the children ran to him as usual. He greeted them with hugs and kisses and turned to tell Carol thanks and goodbye. Can I talk to you a minute? She asked. Of course, Carol. What do you need to talk about? I can't watch the children for you anymore. It was obvious she'd surprised him. Why? What's the problem, Carol? What is it, hon? I'm sure we can work it out. She lowered her gaze. I can't tell you. I just know I can't watch them anymore. Carol, maybe you can talk to Sylvia. She can help, I'm sure. Please, hon, tell us what's wrong. You know, sometimes it helps to talk about things. I know. And you're so nice, and Mrs. Stillwater, too, and I love Paul and Lynn so much, but I can't talk about this. I can't tell you why. Please. I'm sorry. But I just can't. She stood abruptly and ran out the door. The rest of the week was miserable. She stayed in her apartment for fear of running into the Stillwaters. They'd knocked on her door several times, but she pretended not to hear, and when Sunday finally arrived, Caroline could feel her anticipation grow. Waiting for Toby's call was making her crazy. She would tell him everything. Just hearing his voice would make everything better. She was just sure of it. It was so nice to have a friend like him, older, mature, and true. Her mother was always worse on Sundays since she'd had the entire weekend to work herself up. Caroline figured it would be perfect because she would pass out by 6 o'clock for sure. However, at 7, her mother was still going, and she called Caroline to her and handed her a dollar bill. Run up to the store and get me a candy bar." Carol's heart began to pound. She could refuse and face a beating, or go and possibly miss the phone call. Why, oh, why hadn't they arranged an exact time for the call? "Well, what are you waiting for?" Her mother shook the money at her. "I can do this," Carol thought. "I can make it. I'll run the whole way. And then when I get back, she'll take the candy and go to her room, and I won't see her the rest of the night." She grabbed the dollar and took off. The little convenience store was located at the end of the street at the top of a hill. It would take 15 minutes tops. She ran as fast as her legs would carry her. Nevertheless, her greatest fear was taking place as she burst through her door, candy in hand. "Who are you?" her mother was shouting into the phone. Caroline tried to take the phone from her. "Let me take it, Mama," she pleaded. "The hell you will!" She slapped Caroline away and turned her attention back to the caller. "I know what you want from my daughter, and you're going to have to get it somewhere else." "No, Mama," Caroline screamed, mortified. She reached for the phone again, and this time, though, her mother reared back and knocked Caroline in the head with the receiver. Caroline stumbled backward and slipped to the floor, the room spinning. Her mother returned her attention to the young man on the phone. "Let me tell you something, Buster. My daughter is off limits to you. Do you understand me? Don't you ever call here again, or I swear I'll have you arrested." She slammed the phone down. Virginia Jones turned and stood over her fallen daughter. Caroline was unsure of her mother's next move. Maybe another lesson in men, maybe another beating. She thought of what Toby must be thinking right this very minute and decided she didn't care. She would rather die right now. "You little pig," her mother forced between clenched teeth. "You gave yourself to him, didn't you?" "No, Mama, I swear I didn't," she cried as she struggled to her feet. "Did you like it, girl?" Caroline could feel her face burn. "Mama, it wasn't like that. We're just friends." "Don't you lie to me, little girl. He has a voice like a man. You telling me you're friend with a grown man? Oh, I just bet you were real friendly. That's who gave you the new clothes and the earrings, wasn't it? What's his name, Caroline? I'm calling the police. His rear end will be in jail by tonight." "No," Caroline pleaded. "You can't do that. He's just a friend." "Don't you tell me what I can't do," her mother shrieked. And those Stillwaters took you up there and let him have you. I should go over there right now and give them a piece of my mind." Caroline wasn't sure what came over her. Resolve, maybe. Defiance, definitely. Maybe it was her need to protect Toby. He didn't deserve to get in trouble just for being nice to her. "I'm telling you right now, he didn't do anything to me, and if you call the police, I'll run away. I'll leave and you'll never find me." "Don't you talk to me like that, you little—" She swung at Caroline's face. But enough was enough, and Caroline's hand came up to block the blow, and before she could stop herself, she shoved her mother with all her might, and Virginia Jones stumbled backward, sprawling onto the sofa. "I hate you, Mama," Caroline screamed. "I hate you. You've ruined everything." Turning, she bolted up the stairs. And that is the end of chapter 2.